There's a real art to presenting useful insights about the role of intelligence in the formulation, implementation, and execution of foreign policy. For decades, the US has been sparring first with the USSR and now with the Russian Federation. There's been an unending struggle with Russian intelligence agencies as it works against our national interest and our national security. We've continued to witness reports of Russian hacking, Russian interference with our election, and a constant stream of disinformation. What are the key lessons from our intelligence successes and failures over the past 75 years? What will help us to understand how the US can address our current strategic shortfall, emerge ahead of the Russians, and be prepared for what's to come from any adversary? Jack Devine is one of the legendary spy masters of our time. He knows more about almost anyone about the CIA's vital importance as a tool of American statecraft. He was in Chile when Allende fell. He ran Charlie Wilson's war in Afghanistan. He was involved with the Iran-Contra. He oversaw efforts to run down the master narcotics trafficker, Pablo Escobar, in Colombia. He ran CIA stations in Latin America and Rome. Jack Devine served American interest in more than 30 years in a wide range of covert operations, ultimately overseeing the Directorate of Operations, a CIA component that watches over thousands of American covert operations worldwide. Welcome to Foreign Policy at Chappaqua, Jack. We've been looking forward to your virtual visit.
It's great to be here.
Work and your recent book, hold up the book. It says here, your recent book, which Tyler has a copy of as well, but he's hiding behind the T. And Joan has one, she's hiding behind her Chappaqua Library thing. From your experience, first with the USSR and now the Russian Federation, what are the 3 or 4 areas that our members should focus on to get a good grasp of this important subject?
One of the themes that I think is worth discussing, because it'll be in everyone's mind, is I turned to television this morning and forgot who, well, I know who was speaking, but I don't want to take his name in vain, was talking about, China is the exclusive enemy that we have to worry about. It's an economic, political threat and all this. And I think that's true. Over the long term, and I want to get this out of the way, China represents a very serious challenge to the United States in the broader scheme of military, political, and economic things. But my book is really focused on Russian intelligence and, as it relates to involvement in the United States internal political affairs. And there, Russia is light years ahead. It's not in the collection of information, but fooling around in our democratic process. And I think that's terribly, terribly important. And, you pointed out that I spent a lot of years in the Cold War. We had an understanding in those days, you won't find it in writing anywhere, that there were certain things we did and didn't do. We didn't counterfeit money because we would destroy each other's economies. So that was off board. We didn't rough up each other's officers. There's a few exceptions there, which we could go into someday. But one of the key items was the interference in internal affairs. After the Stalin years, and remember, I ran all of CIA's operations at one point. I'm telling you definitively, that was not part of the game plan, no matter what movie you see, involving ourselves in the activities inside Russia. There are a few exceptions in the United States where the Russians did it, but, and again, I don't want to prolong the answer for a second, but the 2016 involvement and the way they got involved, not just the collecting, because everybody collects, but the fact that they used it politically to try and interfere in our election and continue to do that, to me, needs more attention, and it's getting de-emphasized among a large number of people. I can give you 2 or 3 other things we need to be mindful of, if you like. I think when you look at CIA, and I'm sure today we're going to talk about covert action, one of the things I find in audiences of all ages is really a misunderstanding and have locked in their mind the rogue CIA, which there are a few incidents, and we can talk about some of those today. But everyone needs to realize that if you don't like something the CIA's doing around the world in the action arena, not spying, but making things happen and change, then you really need to talk to the President of the United States, because I don't know of a single operation that wasn't signed in writing by the president after the mid-70s. And then before that, all were approved, but not all, but not all in writing. So I think that's another important thing that I would point out. The third thing that I will tease out in a bigger way is just how important Putin is and understanding his mindset. And the book's called Spy Master and Prism, and that's how do you look at the world through a spy master? I wasn't a spy, I ran spies, and that's an important distinction. And I have a chapter called The Spy Master President, and that's about Putin. And what's very interesting, I have a subtitle or quote, which says, there is no such thing as an ex-KGB officer, Vladimir Putin. Well, I would tell you the same thing, that there's no such thing as an ex-CIA officer, Jack Devine. It doesn't mean that he's on the payroll of the KGB or that I am, but there's a mindset, the way of looking at the world. And in his case, in my case, we are products of the Cold War and the dynamics. So I think, we'll let the audience have at it on this, but these are a couple of the big themes that I think are worth our listeners here thinking about or challenging if they like.
Jack, where does the Crimea and the Ukraine fit into your analysis?
Well, it's really interesting when you look at Russia. It's punching much above its weight. If you're into boxing, you'll know what that means. But if you look at Russia's economy, it's more similar to GDP to Spain or Italy. But if you throw the Ukraine in with Russia, it becomes a much more powerful country. And that's why all through the Tsar period and the communist period, having the Ukraine as part of it was critically important. So we should have realized that when the Ukraine was falling apart, that the Russians were not going to let it just drift into the West. So they mounted both a covert action operation and not so covert when they put little green men into the eastern part and took over the Crimea. It's totally consistent with the Cold War mentality of where the Ukraine fits in the scheme of things. And they went in, and our response was rather weak, and they've stayed there. And there are sanctions, and I'm grateful for the sanctions. But I can assure you that the Russians are working very hard to politically and economically position the western part of Ukraine to be supportive of for Russia. So I think it's a critical, Berlin used to be a hot spot in the Cold War, but Ukraine in many ways reflects sort of the outward face of Russia and how it views the world.
Jack, I know you spoke before about the length and the immediacy of the length of our problem with China and the immediacy of our problem with Russia. But did you go a little further on the Russia-China? Because our group has been looking at the Far East all this spring and wondering whether there's some other kinds of differences or similarities that we could draw from to understand the spy master's prism.
Well, let me talk on the Russian side. So there's a famous spy who worked on our side, who was the deputy chief of the SVR, which is the new name for the KGB. And he was the deputy in the New York office. So he worked for several years, and then he came out in 2004. When he came out, he said, well, it was interesting. When I joined as a young man, the number one target was the United States, the number two target was NATO, and the number three target was China, right? So when I left and came out and joined you, the number one target was the US, the number two was NATO, and number three was China. So China has, there's there's an attempt to have some sort of rapprochement between China and Russia, but these things run hot and cold. I want to put a footnote because I know we're going to get into it in more detail. We live in a new world, the cyber world, and let me just stick to the intelligence part of it. It has revolutionized the way we do intelligence. And there are no ground rules. As I said earlier, there were rules, not rules, but understandings. There are no understandings on the use of cyber in today's world. And it's very hard to have a public agreement. There was one with China, between the United States and China a few years ago, that didn't make a lot of sense to me, because no one can come to the table and admit they're doing everything possible to exploit the cyber world. And that's true of all nations. So when you see a cyber violation, we should be annoyed and angry, and the more aggressive, the more we should look that way. And the Russians have been extremely aggressive. As you know, very recently, they hit the State Department, DHS, Treasury, very aggressive. And I believe we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. So everyone's in the cyber world, but if you were to look at China and how it collects intelligence, and it's where it is on the curve of intelligence operations. For many years, it was technical. It would collect everything it could. Right? That was its objective, and it still is scooping it up. And it still is scooping it up in the cyber world. The Russians easily match them, and I'm quite confident when I say that. The difference is the Russians have a strategy, which they actually have a name for it. It's the hybrid strategy. It's to use of propaganda and cyber as part of their national security strategy abroad. In other words, in addition to military and economic, it is actually part of a strategy. So the difference between the two in this space is that the Russians are aggressive in using it inside, not just collecting, but using it. Big distinction. Now, the Chinese, the Russians, the Tsar's period, but they were very heavily involved in the communist years starting in 1917. The United States really comes to intelligence reluctantly. Many a times we've used it in the wars. George Washington used it, Lincoln, Roosevelt. But every time the war's over, we sort of disarm our intelligence. We're just not comfortable with secrets in America, right? Now, in 1947, they built the intelligence agency. But even there, one of the big distinctions with the CIA is that it works totally abroad, right? Where the KGB worked abroad and internally, so these are big distinctions. But the Chinese were slow in their development to run operations, human-type intelligence spy operations in the United States. You can see that changing. There have been a few cases where people have been arrested and prosecuted and are becoming more aggressive, but they're much further behind on collecting and having human sources operations in the United States. They have run some very good operations against us and others in China. So I think if I were looking at this, and remember, my prism is one of the intelligence world, right? So I'm not really going to get into trade agreements and all that other than in the most macro sense. But when you look at the intelligence world, I think these are a couple of the big distinctions and similarities where they are that I think are worth focusing on.
Since you brought up the technology and the cyber intrusion, obviously we get upset, and there's a lot of press and there's a lot of statements when Russia does it to us. I'm sure we do some of it to them. But the question has actually come up even before we opened this session. What are we doing to protect ourselves? Not only in the short term, are we making the kinds of investments to enhance our ability? What's happening in our world?
Now, let me take the first point because I want to make an exception here to what you said. I'm not convinced the intelligence world is operating inside the Soviet Union and their political activities. I have no reason to believe that's the case. Now, we do have, if you look at the Mueller report, most people accept the Russian intervention I mean, if you read it, it's really hard to walk away from the fact that the Russians weren't intervening not only with in the cyber world and the social media, but they were also trying to run human operations, running around trying to recruit people, rather Keystone Cop like. But um, my my point is that I have no reason to believe that we are doing that. This is a really big point, because if they don't stop, it begs the question: what do we, what do we do? So in this cyber and how do we defend ourselves? I still believe the United States is, in fact, we're much more powerful. Most Americans really don't truly appreciate how we're viewed around the world from a power point of view. And having represented the government across the broad spectrum of countries and continents, or the intelligence world, always amazed that the overwhelming sense of how important the United States was in their lives. That was not true in Russia, and it's not not as true with the Chinese either, as much as some people would like to present that. So when we travel abroad, we underestimate just how powerful we are, and I think that's we show great restraint, and that's another factor in our favor, and I think we should continue to show restraint. But if the Russians continue down this path, or the Chinese pick up the pace internally and start interfering, then I think we have to worry about it. But I have very high regard for our capabilities. I think the Cyber Command and NSA, but truly, there is no country that can protect itself. This is why there needs to be rules. There is no defense system that, there's no defense system. What defense system do you have against nuclear weapons? I mean, you have limited, have some capability to shoot down missiles and so on, but any nuclear exchange, you're going to get hit. So we're nowhere near the type of control that we have over the world of missiles and nuclear weapons. So cyber is the Wild West. I think we're doing everything we can. We're probably at the cutting edge of protection, but it's the easiest vehicle to use as an offensive weapon that has been invented to cause trouble inside of a country.
There's another piece of our foreign policy that touches on what you've said, the role of Congress in the U.S. foreign policies in a structural or procedural or a strategic or immediate sense. Are we doomed to, on our side, to have a perennial bipartisan dance of electioneering, then governance, and electioneering, then governance, so that there's no continuity, not only on the diplomatic side, but even on the intelligence side?
Well, let me make a couple of points. First, I'm a big believer in oversight. And you say, well, God, a CIA person saying that? I think most of the professionals would say that there's a reason for it, and it's very valuable. Oversight. So the other thing I would point out is that the country had a consensus during the Cold War, and there were variables between Democrats and Republicans, for sure. But when I would go down and brief Congress, and when I ran the program to get the Russians out of Afghanistan, there was a consensus about, what was in America's interest, and it was really trying to push back and say, look, I really don't need all of that. Maybe I had some regrets about that now, but the point is bipartisan important. In fact, when I go in the book, I talk about when do you use covert action, and I think we'll talk about that at some point. But one of my personal preconditions would be that you have bipartisan support on the Hill. So I'm hopeful that we will regain that, and need to really regain that bipartisan sense. And the Congress represents the American people. That's why it's such a good break on wild policies, because the Congress knows it has to go back and sell it, because all covert action operations are virtually will eventually become public. So I'm not very hopeful at this moment. I think we're in a bad place on bipartisan support. But sometimes the world works in our favor and conditions happen to draw us back to reality. So, but I think your point, your fundamental point is the ability to do certain things abroad are hampered by not having a bipartisan consensus about national security. And it hasn't always been the case. There's been arguments. If you look at Central America and what we did in Afghanistan, there was a disagreement, but is what I would consider a reasonable disagreement among a common consensus. And but at the end of the day, the Congress and the Intelligence Committee, even today, are much more tight-lipped and more protective of national. You get more bipartisan support on that committee, I believe, than any other. At least that's been my sense. But there's a lot of room for improvement for this country's national interest.
Jack, there's a perennial question for people like you. What keeps you up at night? What are the issues that really bother you, the things that really bother you in this world that touch on the intelligence community?
Well, if you hadn't asked the last part, I would have said my family. But but if you talk about national security, so I mean, I think we always have to be concerned about countries with nuclear weapons. So you put at the top of your list, the concerns with Russia and China, and I don't see. I think there's reasonableness there. I do worry about the trend with China and the U.S. and where that may lead to a misjudgment and some sort of kinetic exchange, hopefully short of nuclear exchanges. North Korea has been a wild card as long as I've looked at the problem, and now they have nuclear weapons. We've been able, as a country, as a world, and let me give the credit to the world. I remember Jack Kennedy, when I was a kid, speaking, saying, we're going to have 160 countries with nuclear weapons, but the effort to contain it was successful to a relatively small number. When I look at those that have it, there are two spots that I continue to be worried about, and that's India and Pakistan, because they've gone to war 3 times since World War II. There's long-standing disputes, and there might be a military clash that could lead you there. I don't see it. I don't see it in the cards. So that brings me to number 1, and that's Iran, right? So that would tip the balance in the Middle East, because I can't imagine some of the wealthy states in the Middle East letting Iran have a nuclear weapon and not either try to get nuclear weapons or rent them or whatever. So I think you could have an even more unstable environment in the Middle East if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. And I think the prospects of that are fairly reasonable.
Tyler, you usually have solid questions, and I know you've read the book. Tell me what you're thinking about.
Sure. Well, Jack, in the book, you do mention that there's kind of a sense that the big players, China, the US, and Russia, agree that we're in a situation of what you could call mutually assured cyber destruction. Now, you have alluded to that already, but what you point out is what is more dangerous really are the rogue players. Now, first of all, do you really think that the kind of unspoken agreement between the big 3 that we're not going to destroy each other from a cyber aspect really still pertains? In other words, the Russians, you would think might make exception to that, and Putin would get impatient and say, I'm really going to whack the American or the US power grid just to show them what I can do. I'm just wondering how far you think go.
Let me be really clear from where I sit. There aren't any rules of the road. We don't have that Cold War understanding. There is no understanding that Russia won't use it or that we won't. There's no understanding with the Chinese that we will use it, let alone rogue states. So what I was getting at earlier is there's a great instability in this. And the Russians, and that's why 2016 is so important to me. It's not in the context of the election. It's in the context of actually using cyber internally inside the United States to influence election. That is not part of the understanding. So there's no rules. And I do think no, the Chinese and the Russians are not going to bring down the grid in the middle of the night and think that that's something that's going to pass unnoticed, right? So I think there is some self-restraint on everybody's part, but there is an area that, you know, sometimes intelligence people think, well, I can really pull this one off and no one will ever know. When someone comes in and used to tell me that, I said, get out of here. Someone, there is no such operation. You got to live with certain calculated risks. So Tyler, my real concern is we don't have those agreements. I'm hopeful we're having discussions, but I'm not even convinced of that. It's a hard discussion to have. But what isn't going to work is a group of 17 or 5 or 6 or 8 and making a public statement they're all going to be good, you know, good players here. I just wouldn't put any credence in that whatsoever. And this is a process. I mean, one of the things that the intelligence business, how do you work? One of the great assets, of going back to your question, if you understand the intelligence world, but the great assets the United States had was the product it was selling, you know, democracy, freedom. Actually, it's a very popular product. Try and sell communism. It's a really hard sell after about 1980. Russians had a much harder outside of the Soviet Union operating because most of the world was working, and even neutral countries were much more cooperative with the United States. And when you add all of the intelligence services and capabilities of all the services in the world, it is such a more force multiplier, and that remains to this day. But when you see spy movies, it's always a unilateral one person, you know, blowing up the London Bridge or something. You have to realize, or not you, but everybody, that there's just like the State Department has relationships with the government, so does the CIA, and these are terribly important. And it's also important with our potential adversaries, right? That we have communications. The CIA was often in history very helpful when the official aspect of America was thrown out of a country or the relationships were broken. They often were continued sub rosa between the intelligence services, could continue communicating and cooperating. So, you know, I'm recommending that some of these traditional relationships, if they're not warmed up, they should be. I should point out that someone will ask me this at some point, but I was in Moscow in 1991. And, you know, as I said, I was the chief of the Afghan task force to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan. The Stinger went in under my watch. The chief was a guy by the name of Milt Bearden. Years later, he became the head of Russian operations, and I was running counter narcotics. And he called me and said, Jack, would you come to Moscow? We're trying to warm up the relationship with the Russians. The only thing we can talk about is narcotics because everything else requires sources and methods. Will you come out? And I said, look, Milt, you know, last thing I feel like doing is going to Moscow. I got a lot going on here. He said, I got a deal for you. The deal is you come out and the KGB has agreed that you, the guy who ran it from Washington, the guy who ran it from the field, will get on the Friendship Bridge where the Russians departed from Afghanistan, and we'll have our pictures taken together. And it'll all be under the guise of going down to look at the poppy fields. And I said, Milt, I'm in. So what I'm saying is, and this is really some hope here, when nations have really irascible types of relationships at times, there are opportunities to former combatants, if you will, come together and try and work things out. So it does happen. And it was a productive visit. I was supposed to see, there's some pictures of the book of me in the KGB headquarters, but I was supposed to meet the head of the KGB. And instead I met the deputy. I thought it was perfectly fine. I mean, I'm not the head of the CIA, no reason he should. But what I realized, that was June of 91. In June of 93, August of 91, there was a coup against Yeltsin. It was led by the director of the KGB. He was too busy plotting, you know. So my point here, coming back, Tyler, is that, you know, when we're in these situations, there's a lot to be said for diplomacy and the State Department and CIA. These are real arts and skills that are developed, and I'm hopeful that they're being used. I just don't see any indication that they're being successful if they're taking place.
Yeah. Another observation in your book, I was really struck by the fact that you were rather appalled by what you call Putin's recklessness. I mean, we all know he's pugnacious, aggressive, absolutely determined to disrupt the U.S. and the West. But you said it with him, it goes beyond that, that he does stuff that occasionally it just doesn't make sense, is stupid, and it sends him to the brink of doing something very, very painful for both sides.
Yeah, I would qualify a little bit since the book is as of 2020, the election, right? I mean, we talk about what lies ahead. But one of the things, when going to the point, I really thought going in and meddling in the election was bizarre. It was a violation of the Moscow rules. But why are you dabbling? What do you expect to get out of this? I mean, you really want, and this is not a political statement, you want a president you don't know, you have no track record with, as opposed to a candidate that you would know, and the government and all the arrangements. You have an unpredictability. Most leaders aren't really looking for that type of risk. So I thought, this is silly. But if you fast forward to today and you say, this rather limited, it was when in the book, I'll describe the hundreds and thousands and actually millions of people that got impacted by it. But in my view, it was still around the edges. But if you look at the results of it, we ended up trying to impeach the president twice. We've been fighting down on the Hill, and it had its roots in this half-baked operation, if you will. So when I pull back, I'm saying, well, maybe he's not so half-baked. It's just hard for me to say, look, he actually saw how it was going to play out and be so devastating to our political bipartisan frame of mind. So I'm qualifying it as I reflect on Putin. He is I give him an A for tactics on carrying out his operations. I think he's clear-eyed. I mean, that's why I call him the spy master president. I think he has a terrible strategy for dealing with the West, but even for Russia. I think it's a long-term situation. We should have a reset with Russia. So we should be part of the West and trade and democracy. There's no ideology blocking it. There's no communism conquer the world. So I think he has decided, because of the way he came to be the head and his experience in the KGB, he's really rooted in a mindset the United States is an enemy, like a Cold War enemy, and that's everything that happens bad is tied to us. So, so I think I'm giving a little more credence to the purposeness of what I thought at the very beginning was just a one-off. Oh, here's something we could do. And this happens in the intelligence community. And I point out, if my colleagues are listening, don't do it. Don't dabble in this stuff. Don't play around with operations, right? You really have to have clear focus. You have to have a reason. One of the key reasons, you have to believe it's going to be successful. Just don't do it to irritate people. No one should have time for that. And they get off the track when you do those sorts of things.
Jack,
Oh, go ahead, Mel.
I was going to say, I'm starting to see some inputs from our members abroad.
They're getting
Manuel
excited.
Hasberg says, how would you react to the last declaration by President Biden that Putin is a murderer? Is this wise as a diplomatic point of view? Is it a trend to serve escalation? What does this bring about operationally?
Well, going back to Tyler's question, there's a part that I was talking about, the strategic part. But all through Russia's history, assassinations have been part of its history. And even during the Cold War, assassinations had taken place. The famous umbrella assassination on the bridge in London and so on. But then you have the more recent ones using nerve gas. And when you look at it, it's manufactured by a country, and it's Russia, right? So it's a bit going to Tyler's point. It's like in your face. Why are you doing that? People, you can make people disappear. I'm not recommending it, but I'm just saying you can make people disappear without such fanfare. Why are you doing that? So there's a message in it, and that's the hard edge, that the Tyler was talking about. So how do you want to characterize that? So the point is, if you want to do what I want to do, is, you have to be strong. The Russians will not, the Iranians, the Chinese, all of them will only respect power. In fact, most countries in the world only do. And no matter what they say. But you usually try and warm up the audience a little bit. So, there might have been a diplomatic answer there that I would have recommended, that you not be so candid about it. But there's a deep history here of assassination. So if you want to go there, in some debate, you could argue that case. I just think it's probably not the good way to start a new relationship. And he took offense, of course.
One of our members, who's now on the West Coast, asked the question, has the US ever been penetrated to the degree that Britain was in the 40s with the Cambridge Five, or that Alger Hiss was at the height of the US State Department? Does the US have the kind of safeguards in place these days?
Now, this is a question that I go into the book, and actually I've written 2 books in there, both in there because in different ways, but the big part of it is counterintelligence. Any intelligence service, intelligence community, US government must have a counterintelligence side. And earlier you were asking about cyber, and that's counterintelligence. How do you block it? So I go into this in the book, but there was an American CIA officer named Rick Ames, a CIA officer, and he worked in CIA, and he worked for the Soviet Union. He passed the names and identities of, I believe it was 11 of our sources inside the KGB. They were all executed, every single one. I knew Rick. I went to his wedding, So, and I can elaborate on what I think, what is in the makeup of a spy. And then when I was the head of worldwide operations, there was a spy inside the FBI. His name is Robert Hansen. And we were looking for him because we thought he was in CIA. In the book, I make the point that you must work on the assumption that you have penetrations throughout the government. This is what the Russians do, the Chinese do, and that's what we did. You get sources that can provide the plans and intentions, because cyber only takes you so far. You're still missing what's the motivation, because the machine doesn't tell you that. So the answer to your question is we have always had, always will have, because of the human frailties. Graham Greene calls it the human factor. Is a book on it. The frailties of people, and what makes a spy. And it's not that easy to find. In fact, I have a chapter called "It Takes a Spy to Catch a Spy," and I don't know of a case off the top of my head where we found a spy without having a spy within their system. So to your question, I think we're doing, making a serious effort, have always made a serious effort. It's a very hard field. And I'm hopeful that we're successful. But there was a group it was one of the senior people in the agency wanted everybody to wear a button after Ames, never again. And I didn't wear one because I knew we were hunting for Hansen. So how can you put a button on never again when you knew it was part of human frailty? So the answer to your question is, it is and I'm glad you raised it, because, we're talking about a lot of different things, but, in the Le Carre's world of spying and espionage, the counterintelligence and knowing about moles and realizing that they're in the government. And if you look at even the Russians' effort in the election, they were running around trying to find human sources. And I think they were frantic because the Trump group coming in was largely unknown to them. And they probably were a little thin on sources. That's my professional judgment.
Stanley Lenkowski asked the question, after 4 years of what he calls rogue, do-it-yourself foreign policy run by the former president, what's your thought about tightening up the restraints against such reoccurrence?
Reoccurrence, I think we would need to clarify what we're talking about, the reoccurrence.
Well, do it yourself, go around this established
Yes, okay,
processes.
got it. So as I spoke a few minutes ago, I spoke of the importance of working with foreign governments and liaison, right? And I think that's absolutely true and a great force multiplier. But also in the spy business, you also have unilateral assets. You have to have people that you only know and you're only dealing with. So there is a role for America. We don't have to be in the consensus all the time. But if you're going to go into Afghanistan and we're trying to go to Pakistan, you need the Pakistanis and you need people on the ground, and we needed allies to provide weapons. It's always good to have that support. So I think it's a prudent policy to reach out to foreigners on every major issue. But bear in mind, when you get to the table, even our very best allies come with an agenda. Every country, I've never dealt with someone across the table. I've dealt across the table just about every group. And they all come with an agenda that represents their national interest. So when we go to the table, we need to go with an agenda that's our national interest. And then you start there and see where are the common points of interest. And where there isn't, where there's disagreement, and when you think that you can't arrive at agreement, then you must take decisive action. I've also seen, and even in recent years, America still leads, even though foreign governments may not like the agenda, they will try to reach forward. This is where Americans don't understand well enough as I think they should, that most of the allies around the world do really want to be with us on in most things, and to the degree that we can find that playbook to do that, we should. So we're not there to just accept a vote 10-1 that we want to do something, and because we are who we are, they give us a lot more leeway. So, but I'm a big believer in diplomacy and consensus, but it's not exclusive.
Do values play a role in that?
Well, I would hope so. And all through my career, every time I came from a foreign assignment, 7 of them, and every time you landed in the United States, you may not like the taxi cab driver. You may not. He's yelling about the president. This and the president. You sit there and say, really like to give this guy a big fat kiss on the cheek, because this is a place where the cab driver can assault the president of the United States and say what he wants and do what he wants. And it's a great country, and opportunities still prevail here. So values are really important. And I think, what we stand for is really important. When we look like we're fighting among ourselves, we're clouding our values. And again, I think this is a leadership issue of all parties and all peoples, is to project America's real values. They're pretty consistent. Freedom, free speech, freedom of religion, assembly. The founding fathers were really quite famous. We were one lucky country out of 7 million people to get the talent that we had to put together the Constitution. Most of the world marvels. As the older I get, the more I marvel at the Hamiltons and the Washingtons. If you don't believe in divine destiny, that's fine. But sure, it looks like somebody shined on us in the formation of this country, and that's why I think we were I would say predestined to defeat the communists in the Cold War. They just didn't have a product, and we still are, despite our freckles, a problem. I mean, are still the best game in town by far.
And Russell asks, Can you please give us some more examples of rules, norms that could work and how they work?
Well, I think you want to start with what's off bounds. In other words, let's not make a magnibus omnibus charter. Just what are we not going to do? And I would start with principle number one: we're not going to interfere in each other's countries. Because if you foul up and make a mistake, you really require a counteraction. And that counteraction, my experience over a long time, even the Afghan war is very emblematic of that. You know, they did one thing, we did another, they did, and it kept escalating, right? And eventually the stinger broke the back of the process. But so that's why you need the diplomacy.
We've got a question from Jeffrey Sherman. Can you talk about the degree of our involvement and its success or failure in the Islamic world, like Iran, Syria, etc.?
Well, the Middle East has played since the beginning of time, right? Western history time. It's been, and there's so many more better experts. Frank Wisner you had here before. Frank can give you chapter and verse on life in the Middle East. But, there's two major movements within the Islamic world, and one is Sunni and one Shia. And there's been centuries and centuries of struggle. And at different points in history, it's a bit subjugated, or it seems to be when you're looking at it from the West. But I think when we look at the dynamic today, we're back looking at these huge religious divides, and Iran being the Shia country and Saudi Arabia being Sunni, and relative allies on both sides. Now, I do think we've made a lot of progress in the last 25 years in improving the environment around Israel, I think, in softening up that part of the world for cooperation. I think we still have, and as you said at the very beginning, what keeps you up at night? Iran is still very problematic, and there's different values, and when you have different values, you need to at least agree on some principles on how you're not going to rub up against each other. I'm on record often saying, we really shouldn't intervene in the Middle East with troops on the ground. It's like Colin Powell once said, you take over a country like Iraq, you own it. It's yours.
Broke it, you own it.
Yeah, broke it, you own it. So Afghanistan, I thought when bin Laden attacked the United States, there was no doubt in my mind that we should have, and we did, go right in after him and after the Taliban. And the CIA went in, and special forces were there with us, brought down the Taliban. There was no major U.S. presence. And my experience would lead me to believe that you do things using covert capabilities unless we're attacked and unless you think you have a chance of prevailing. And in the case of Afghanistan, the British went in and found the downside of going into a country and trying to have a permanent imprint. I think there's, the British learned the lesson, the Russians learned the lessons, and I think we're going to learn the lesson. We're pulling out, and I'm not optimistic about how that's going to turn out. I'm not opposing pulling out, but I'm just saying, after all the time, money spent, often, and I'm a big advocate for covert action. I know it's going to make people hair curl, but there is a gap. You work with diplomacy as much as you can and economic thing, but then there's a step before war, and that's covert action trying to make things move. So I think democracy is not something people have to want it. You don't want to force feed it. So in the Muslim world, in address to this question, I think to many ways the Muslim world has to sort out its big issues, and we just need to make sure, without boots on the ground, that there's nothing that is inimical to our national security that takes place. So. I'm consistent on this. I think going into Afghanistan was wise. I think going into Iraq, when you say, how can we make things better? I mean, there's going back to a lot of broken glass that, you know, that's on the floor. So that first big step has a long trail. You know, here we are 20 years later, still talking about it.
Well, in the case of Iraq, there is still 20 years later a question about the intelligence that led us there, at least under Bush 41. What?
Well, I think there are occasions when intelligence is wrong. You know, I think, however, the prevailing sentiment in all sectors in the United States was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Today, people, oh, I never thought that. Well, it's really hard to find someone who's on the record on that had it. What I had a problem is I didn't see anything that led me to believe that there was a threat that was imminent, they were going to use it. And I didn't know how right I was, because if you don't have them, that's not going to happen. So I think where the intelligence it broke down on both levels, and but there was a policy mindset that coincided with faulty intelligence. I mean, I understand from some people the analysis was pretty good, but this is not. This is an example. I think when you decide to go to war, you have to, this is why you have to have really good intelligence sources that can tell you with certitude before you amass an army. And it doesn't feel to me, well, history has shown that we didn't have that.
Liz Littlefield asked the question.
Let me just
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the end. This is not to diminish intelligence. An awful lot of things depend on really good analysis. In fact, even with human intelligence, you have to have good analysis. But I can't emphasize how important the spy business is in this critical area. With all the cyber capabilities, you really have to know what are the plans and intentions of countries that are hostile to our interests, as was Iraq. So this is not in demeaning all the great analysis that takes place based on all the intelligence available.
Liz Littlefield asked the question, can you comment on the significance of Putin's new, quote, kill list of targets, which includes Bill Browder? I haven't heard that myself. Does this equal a tactical escalation?
Well, I haven't seen the list. I have no idea that such a list exists. I very much doubt that there's a formal list. I'll pass on that. That he doesn't like Browder, there's no doubt about it, right? But trust me, if the KGB wanted to take care of the problem, they don't need a long list. They can do it. Are they prepared? I know of no incident. I know some people think otherwise of any assault on an American in the United States. I think that's that bridge too far to cross, or abroad for that matter. So that part of the Moscow rules, even though no one's meeting or talking about it, that probably exists in people's minds. It would be such an outrage. It would require a terribly forceful response that things start to unravel. Statecraft and brinkmanship is very dangerous, and I worry about brinkmanship in the world of cyber. It's too hard to calibrate.
Harry Stanton says the following: I was taught that CIA was created to resolve the chaotic relationship between the intelligence sources that allowed the Pearl Harbor fiasco. Yet, subsequent U.S. history is studded with massive coordination failures and intelligence surprise. Korea, 9/11, Kuwait, et cetera, et cetera. How would you rate the agency, he says?
A plus. A double plus when I was there. That's a joke, right? Look, it's understanding the process.
It's slacked off a bit, though, since you've left.
No. Look, they're better. They're smarter. They're better looking, smarter. But when you look at the business, like we were talking about, there's you always have a mole, right? you know, you talk about analysis, and when you go back and, you know, the question of connecting the dots, right, became the slogan after 9/11. And it was, well, you know, that's a really catchy phrase, but you have to have the dots to connect, right? And there wasn't enough evidence on collecting the dots, right? So, but after World War II, what we learned was that the military was divided. It's much more united in United Command now, but the Navy wanted ships because of a threat, and the Army wanted uh, rifles, and the Air Force wanted more planes. So the intelligence was altered because of the interest of the different services. And then the other thing was missing Pearl Harbor. The data was out there, but it wasn't connected that particular time. But I would say most days of the week, the information's connected. It just so happened that Pearl Harbor, you know, was the wrong one to miss. The 9/11 isn't as obvious as I think a lot of people look at it. Every investigation that I've ever seen where there's been a flap, intelligence flap, you go back and it is not that there's 3 people that were really egregiously wrong. It's there's 100 that some little thing went wrong. So it's a little harder to identify these 100 little things. So I'm going to say to you, and you're not going to like it, that while we will always have spies, there will always be shortcomings. The analysis will fail. You don't get to see, and you'll say, well, you're copying out. You don't see that every day the government functions because they are connecting intelligence. There's been a tremendous amount of money and effort to interconnect. I don't think the world, the way we work today, is so much more integrated in sharing information than when I first walked through the doors of the CIA. And it's a really important thing, and I encourage it. But if tomorrow we miss a big one, you know, there should be an investigation. I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts on this one that it'll show no one conspicuous error. It'll just show lots of little ones, and that human frailty. And it's a human business, and you have to understand that it's a human frailty. And you try, what you're really doing is working to reduce the odds. And I think I think we should be proud of our intelligence people. And that means it's like your children, if you will. You know, if I didn't love my children because they made a mistake, if my parents didn't love me, let me make it more personal. Based on mistakes, they were the most loving people in the world, right? So, but you know, good people make mistakes, and you gotta deal with that. And again, today we've got this, we have to chop everybody down, but you know, there's very few. It's not that there's very few saints in the CIA. There's very few saints anywhere.
Jeffrey Sherman asks, how is the CIA doing in attracting the best, the brightest, the most patriotic Americans to make it their career? And I might go one step further. What's the structural and operational capabilities happening these days as we change from administration to administration, sometimes from philosophy to philosophy?
So now we have 2 big different issues, right? So the first one is attracting people. After 9/11, there were 100,000 applications, okay? All walks of life. A friend of mine's a great doctor. I mean, was the head of a unit in one of the major New York hospitals, and he was in his 50s, but he was a marksman. And he came and he said, listen, I think I can be a sniper. And he said, well, I think your mother put you through 3 universities to get all these degrees. I don't see up in a tree, you know? It's like, but it was the heart of America. I mean, count me in, I'm going to walk away from my job. One of the things that always attracts CIA, and if I were interviewing someone for a CIA job and I didn't hear it, they weren't in. I never met anybody that was successful in CIA. I'm happy, you know, successful is relative, but you have to have a sense of mission. I want to serve my country. Now, there has been a diminution of public service across the board, and I think that's unfortunate. I'm not sure exactly why, but the CIA still is pulling in a very high number of applicants and a very high number of highly qualified people that want to serve their country. Now, I'm going to tell you something corny. You know, I used to hate James Bond. I hated all that stuff, you know, Jason Bourne and all that. And then you sit back and say, wait a minute. The world out there thinks you're omnipotent, you know, dashing. All you do is, you know, have fun. So, you know, there's an awful lot of attractiveness out there when you're a young person and you're thinking, there's nothing wrong with selling tires. I don't get that wrong. But you say, well, I'm going to go there or I'm going to be a spy master. And it still has a draw. So the big job is taking and separating people that want adventure and get narrow down to the people that really want to serve their country and prepared to pay the sacrifice. And to be in CIA and in our military, I mean, there's not a soldier on the face of the earth that hasn't, that's sacrificed. So I think we're getting really high numbers. And we're not going to have a problem on the numbers. I think the question will be, I think the shortcoming is on policy. The question I often get is, are we ready? Is the intelligence world ready? And I said, the intelligence world ready? We have policy issues that we've got to sort out among ourselves. And that's that. One of the reforms, I'm glad you raised that. It doesn't come up very often. I ended up writing a op-ed in the Washington Post. I looked at everyone else and I thought, wait a minute, these are all cabinet level. Why are they talking? Why are they asking me to write one? And I was like, I was the deputy director for operations. Why? Then I read everybody's articles. The creation of the super CIA, the DNI, this new organization, will oversee everything. And I wrote, we're just moving deck chairs. We're wasting money, time. We're going to have a huge bureaucracy. And I stand by that one. I'm really proud of that one. But the reason they couldn't find anybody that thought it was a bad idea. I'm going to come back. Our founding fathers really had a good focus on how the place ought to run. And it sure as heck wasn't a monstrosity organization with thousands of people with different buildings all addressing the same issue. So I think it's the structure part is broken. But whenever I talk to somebody in a relative position of changing it, I get the same answer. Yes, but to change it is so monumental that it takes us away from everything we're doing. We're going to work around the edges and we're going to make it work. And the problem with that, it just never happened. It just never happened. So we're big on, and I said, I'm a big fan of Congress. I've never been burnt by Congress, but when they have a problem, it's create a new organization, give it a budget and new authorities, and shrink whatever's below it that's actually doing most of the work. So I really am pretty hard against most of the reforms that I've seen over the years. I really find it counterproductive. But I do recognize, and I'm going to make sure people understand this. I understand the reluctance to take this on. There's no reward. The reform of the CIA, the intelligence community, there is no reward. No one's going to give you a medal for it. And the benefits will not be seen for 15, 20, not immediate. You don't see them. They're not visible. And so you've got to put up with a lot of grief with no payback. Most of the American world has been created around, rewards. And I'll get a job and I'll get it done. I'll be rewarded and I get another job. So the patience and to do something knowing that it's going to cause a lot of grief, everybody's going to hate you for it. No one wants that pain. But I think we've really created a terribly overladen structure.
Every organization, government, non-government, religious, educational, has a problem with long-standing cultures that prevent you from doing something. Could you pick out one for the CIA that's kind of, this is what Providence meant us to be, and I don't care what happens, we're not going to change it?
The CIA, as I said, it was an offshoot of OSS, Colonel Donovan group during World War II that did special ops. And then it was disbanded. There was no CIA, right? After the war, we disbanded it. And then when they created it, guess where they turned? They turned to people that were in the OSS to come in. And I was a generation and a half behind them, but they were still there. And I mean, when you write a book, one of the great advantages, Spy Master's Prison, not exception by any means, you go back and you recreate why. Why is it the way it is? How did I fit in all of this? And when you go back, you realize that they came out of that World War II with, you know, the best generation ever. And I think there's much to be said for that. But the other thing that they came into the building of CIA was can do. You can put that on the middle of your forehead. Can do. Tell me what it is. I'll get it done. That energy. And that's why president after president turned to that culture's can do. You want something done, and it, because of the way it was structured, it could cut out much of the paperwork. I would suggest, however, you not cut it all out. You get in trouble when you don't coordinate and when you don't get Congress, but you can still do it a heck of a lot faster. So I think the spirit of doing it and doing it for your country was what that crowd that walked in the building. And it became, you know, when you went in to see a senior person and it was you're being asked to do something, you better say can do. And you never go in and say, listen, I want to go to Paris. They send you to, you know, to Haiti where they speak French, you know, or Sierra Leone. You know, you go in, you don't ask for things like that. It's to send me where I'm needed. So, and there's another thing that I go in the book, but that's going off a different channel. It was also formed by very tight knit of people in Washington that were part of an elite in the political intelligence world, wined and dined, people from the Washington Post and the writers and the people at the CIA. It was very clubby, which made for very effective, you know, Dulles' brother, the head of CIA, Alan Dulles' brother was head of State Department, really makes for easy coordination. So, but in those early days, there was a lot of energy. So I think that spirit of getting things done, and you'll see it today. If there's a crisis anywhere in the world, the CIA line up, can do, we'll get it done. You have to be careful. And this is where policymakers and Congress come in. Can do can get you trouble. We won't go to the Bay of Pigs, but that's an example of saying, you want it, I can do it. And sometimes you can't always do it. You've got to really look at the, you know, you don't want to discourage can do. It's got to be core, but you have to also be mindful that goodwill, drive, energy, some things are roadblocks. And I go into this in both books.
That is it. Tyler, did I leave you with any questions still on your plate?
Yeah, I've only got about 15 or 20, but I'll go to the top ones. You mentioned in the book, and I keep referring to the book because I think it was very, very interesting. The fact that we've got a new landscape out there in cyber warfare because of the enormous distribution platform that the Russians and the Chinese have with disinformation and misinformation that they didn't have 20 years ago, i.e. we're talking about Facebook and the other social media vehicles. Now that's a two-way street though. So I'm sure that in certain CIA offices in Langley or wherever it is, they're thinking about how can we reverse that flow of dis and misinformation to our benefit, or maybe that just isn't our style. But could you comment on that?
I just realized my assistant came and said, listen, you got to call. I get so wrapped up in enjoying this so much, I'm going to have to duck out. I hope that's okay with everybody, but I've got a business call I've got to take. But let me, I get carried away here with this. And Tyler, can we pick up maybe someday, invite me back and I can pick up?
Absolutely.
Okay, this was a great fun. I love the questions. And I should have gotten off a few minutes ago, but I really enjoyed it because the quality of the questions and the thoughtfulness of it was greatly appreciated. And I hope people do read Spy Master's Prism. If you like it, write to me. If you don't, let's never speak.
Terrific.
But thank you very much. I'm sorry, Tyler. I'll catch up with you later, okay?
Sure. Okay. No, thanks.
Many
Okay.
thanks, Jack, for your terrific program today. We appreciate your insights and your candor about this very important topic. I've learned a great deal. Best wishes on the publication of your new book. The new book.
Thank you. Now, nothing like
I know that we're not the only ones. There's probably another one tomorrow afternoon, another webinar someplace out of Pennsylvania that you're working on.
Well, thank you very much. And you've been a great host. Thank you.
Jack, we hope you will take this opportunity to call on you again. Tyler, Take us home.
Okay. Well, of course, again, many, many thanks to Jack for taking the time to join us today. That's more than obvious. Thanks also to Mal, who was today's recruiter and moderator. Thanks to Joan Kuhn and her colleagues from the Chappaqua Library, as well to Carrie Krams from the Newcastle Media Center, and to all of you who joined us today. Now, in 2 weeks, on April 12th, we will host the first-time visit of retired Ambassador Mark Grossman, who will focus on America's Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, if you have friends or family who'd like to join us in the future, please do email Joan Kuhn. That's J. Kuhn, Kuhn, at WLSmail.org, so that we can be sure to put you on our newsletter and invitation list. So until we meet again on April 12th, stay healthy and safe.